It's a real delight to welcome you all to the first seminar in a series that's running across this academic year at UCL on civilization and its critiques. The series is organised by CREDOC, one of the many acronyms that circulate around UCL, and it is a research centre that was launched at the beginning of this year to explore the dynamics of civilization. So why civilization? Well, because it is a term much bandied about in the 21st century, and so we think it deserves renewed scrutiny after it's sort of been put to one side for some time in a number of our disciplines as a rather perhaps distasteful term. It appears, for example, in popular claims about clashes between religious traditions. It appears in debates about the constitution of Europe and who should be in and who should be out. And in arguments for supra-national identities, such as that of China or of India. Civilization also, because unlike the concepts of culture, society, and nation, it has the scale and duration to permit some big thinking across disciplines about humanity, language and literacy, food and trade, race, religion, urbanism, the environment, progress and decline, as the coal painting is displaying, inequality, and perhaps importantly, the uncivilized, because like gender, civilization is obviously a strongly relational concept, and as we talk about civilization, so we need to talk about the uncivilized. CREDOC is organising in its lifespan lectures and seminars and workshops to stimulate debate about the concept of civilization and to stimulate cross-disciplinary research. So at various points there will be calls made to colleagues within UCL for research grants to run civilizational activity. And colleagues are also very welcome to contact me or my co-director Mike Rowlands with any suggestions for future CREDOC events. And I should apologise on his behalf that he couldn't be here today, but he is currently receiving an honorary degree in some university, I think on the continent. Civilization and its critiques, the seminar series that is running among the different activities that we have this year, is here as a springboard to stimulate that sort of research activity. The aim of the series is to look at critiques of civilization from different disciplinary perspectives. So at the end of this term, there's going to be another critique of civilization seminar with the perspective of archaeology that David Wengrow here is organising. In the second term, we're hoping to have one from the perspective of art history and aesthetics, from the perspective of ancient history and anthropology. But today we thought, where would we start? Well, a good place to start is with the history of the concept in modern political thought, with civilization in the works of Rousseau and Nietzsche, and with appropriations of and challenges to the term beyond the West. Our format is that each of our speakers in turn will come up here and give a short presentation so that there should be plenty of time for discussion at the end. And I should also say, and this is very important, that there is a reception afterwards in the common room next door, to which you're all very welcome indeed. And just to finish, my own expertise as a classicist is largely on the Roman Empire and how it has been troped in later societies to debate the rise and fall of Western civilization. Hence, I'm very fond of this painting and its neoclassical features. But it means that I'm especially grateful that joining me today as co-chair is Alexander Ragmorley, over here, a lecturer at UCL who has arrived very recently from a postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech and the Huntington Library. He only arrived at the beginning of this term, so I'm very grateful that he has found the time in the kind of excitement and the horrors of joining UCL to participate. His expertise lies in the history and philosophy of science in the 17th and 18th centuries, and his research focuses on questions around the much neglected aesthetic, bodily and emotional dimensions of scientific experience. And he's currently finishing a book on aesthetic science in the period of the 17th and 18th centuries. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I have the pleasure of introducing our three speakers for today who have brilliantly arrived and seated themselves in the order in which they'll be speaking, which is a wonderful thing. So our first speaker is Dr. Christopher Brooke, who is a lecturer in political theory at the Department of Politics and International Studies, and brilliantly acronymized as POLIS at the University of Cambridge. And he's also a Fellow and Director of Studies in Politics at Homerton College. Christopher has previously taught at the Universities of Bristol and at Oxford, and his book, Philosophic Pride, Stoicism and Political Thought from Lipsius to Rousseau, was published by Princeton in 2012. Christopher's currently completing a new history of distributive political theory from Rousseau to Rawls, titled, I think you'll agree this is a great title, Who Gets What? Our second speaker is Martin Rühl, and he teaches German intellectual history at the University of Cambridge, with a particular focus on the Wilhelmine and Weimar periods. Last year, he was awarded a British Academy mid-career fellowship to research German ideas of Europe in the long 19th century. Also told me in passing that he got his PhD from Princeton, which is a wonderful thing. And he's published books and articles on Nietzsche, Burckhardt, Ernst Kantorowicz. His monograph, The Making of Modernity, Renaissance Italy and the German Historical Imagination, 1860 to 1930, will appear early next year in the Ideas in Context series of Cambridge University Press, so please look out for that. And finally, we'll be hearing from Faisal Devji, reader in modern South Asian history at the University of Oxford, and also director of the Asian Studies Centre at the University of Oxford, and a fellow of St Antony's College, which is surely the most lively Oxford college that I'm aware of. He used to live across the road. He's also a fellow of the New York University Institute of Public Knowledge and Yves Entremont Chair at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. His most recent book, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, came out in 2013 and is well worth a read. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much, Maria, for the invitation to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to try and keep things fairly brief and fairly informal, and what I want to do is rehearse what's generally the received story about what it was that Rousseau had to say about modern civilization. And then I'm going to indicate briefly what's wrong with the received story. Like lots of received stories, the individual bits of it aren't false, but it obscures most of what's interesting about what it was that Rousseau had to say. And then I'm going to try to show what the debate in France was actually about in the 1750s by introducing the figure of the elder Mirabeau towards the end, to bring another voice into the conversation and actually to bring the idea of civilization itself into the conversation, because it's Mirabeau who coins the word in his book, The Friend of Mankind, the Ami des Hommes. So what's the received story about Rousseau? Well, it's that in 1749, he's a minor contributor to the encyclopedia. He's written most of its articles on music, scratching a living in Paris. Friends with Diderot, the editor of the encyclopedia, and Diderot has got into trouble with the law and is being held in prison at Vincennes. And Rousseau goes to visit him. He walks from Paris to Vincennes to see him. And on the way, he bumps into an advert that is publicizing the essay competition of the Académie de Dijon, and its essay competition for 1749 is a question about progress in the arts and the sciences and whether these have contributed to the development and the purification of morals. And if you believe Rousseau's own accounts he wrote a number of accounts of what happened to him on that day, but he says he was struck dumb and he had an extraordinary vision, and his whole life's work then was visible, and he had this luminous idea that man is by nature good, and it is society who corrupts mankind. And he went to see Diderot, and he poured out his ideas for entering this essay competition and playing the contrarian card, arguing that in fact, far from contributing to the purification of morals, it was the arts and the sciences that had corrupted modern society. And he writes up the essay. It's now called The Discourse on the Arts and the Sciences, or commonly known as the First Discourse. It won the prize that the Academy of Dijon was offering. It was printed, it became an extraordinarily popular work. Rousseau became almost overnight a European celebrity. The exiled King of Poland wrote a rebuttal of what he had to say, and Rousseau spent much of the next couple of years writing replies to the people who replied to him, making the case that it was what was associated with progress that in fact had contributed to rotting the moral foundations of modern society. And then in 1755, the Academy of Dijon had another essay competition, and he entered it again. And this one was his essay, often called the Second Discourse, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality Among Men and Whether It's Authorized by the Natural Law, a much more demanding piece, a much more brilliant piece, in fact. It didn't win the prize. I think it was much too long, so I think it may have been disqualified. And in that essay, Rousseau presents his famous account of the state of nature, to which the phrase "the noble savage" has always been attached. This idea that there's something about the dignity and the self-sufficiency of the savage in the primordial forests, and that the history of the human race since then has been one of degeneration and decline as modern social institutions have taken place. Inequality has been generated and has deepened, and everything is going into hell in a handbasket. When Voltaire received his copy of the Second Discourse, the essay on the origin of inequality, he wrote to Rousseau and he said he'd received a copy of your essay denouncing your essay against the human race, but he said it did make him think about walking on all fours for a bit. And that's the received image of Rousseau that's come down to us, the person who takes on the complacency of the Enlightenment about progress and the development of modernity, and who attacks it in the name of authenticity, in the name of rustic simplicity, in the name of an idealized depiction of savage human beings. And Rousseau basically spent much of the rest of his life saying, no, I don't actually think we should go back and live in the forests. I don't think we should go back and live like orangutans. Rousseau did think that human beings were deeply like orangutans, although he was very confused about orangutans and chimpanzees for complicated reasons. But anyway, I'll stop there. And that's the received view that has persisted down to the present, as Rousseau as the great the auto-critique of Enlightenment, the person who emerges from within the heart of the French Enlightenment and denounces what contemporaries took to be the great achievements of modern science. Well, what's wrong with this view? And the simplest view is that Rousseau was right when he insisted that he didn't want people to go back into the forests, he didn't want people to live like orangutans, he didn't want to turn the clock back. He didn't think you could turn the clock back. He thought that the various changes that had happened to human psychology with the development of human society and history had irrevocably altered the way the human psyche worked in quite fundamental ways. And what he was getting at was a thought that you needed to understand the process that human psychological development had gone through in order to be able to begin to come up with plausible remedies for what you might be able to do in future to try to reduce savage, crippling inequality and the humiliations to which so many people were subject in modern, unequal, commercial class society. And so when we put it like that, it looks as if Rousseau isn't quite the rejecter of modern civilization as the received story has it. He's somebody who's looking for an alternative modernity, new ways of coping with the distinctive predicament that human beings find themselves in the modern world, and various others of his books, The Social Contract, Emile, Julie, the Considerations on the Government of Poland, the Project for a Constitution of Corsica, the Letters Written from the Mountain, often tailored to particular contexts, the Letter to D'Alembert on the theatre in Geneva, are all ways of exploring particular ways in which the pathologies of modernity might be resisted, not in the name of a retreat to savagery, but carving out an alternative kind of modernity. And I want to say something about the language he uses when he talks about civilized man, because if you pick up both of the standard Rousseau dictionaries in English and Nicholas Dent's dictionary in English and the Dictionnaire de Rousseau in French, civilization appears as a key word in both dictionaries, and they have these little essays explaining Rousseau's ideas about civilization. But it's actually very striking that if you look directly at Rousseau's texts, it's not a key word for him. I haven't done a systematic trawl, so I'm not going to stick my neck out and say that he never uses the word civilization, civilisation. But instead he uses the infinitive, civiliser, to civilize, and he uses the adjective, civiliser, civilized. Those are the two terms that you find again and again in the relevant passages where he's being rude about what happens to human beings as they are civilized over time. And you might say this is a quibble, if you've got to civilize and civilized, why can't we just slot in this additional word, civilization? But I think this is where the story actually gets interesting, because civilisation is a coinage of the 1750s, and it's coined by the Marquis de Mirabeau, the father of the French revolutionary Mirabeau, in his book, The Ami des Hommes, which begins publication from the middle 1750s, 1756, 1757. It's a multi-volume work. Mirabeau is one of the physiocrats. And Mirabeau is working very closely with these French arguments in the 1750s about the future prognosis of modern society. And whereas we tend to get used to a periodization that says, well, first you have barbarism, and then you have civility. Civility replaces barbarism. When Mirabeau coined the term and the concept civilization, it was as an attempt to reverse that temporality, to suggest that civility, what we understand in the modern world, is bound up with commerce, the softening of manners, the development of cities, the luxury goods being on sale, and so on and so on. All these things which were characteristically organized under the heading of civility or of polite society or the world of du commerce. Mirabeau was arguing, in something like the way Rousseau had argued, that in fact it was these processes that were helping to destroy the foundations of modern society, that far from being a cheerleader for the economic globalization of the 18th century, figures like Mirabeau worried that the commerce, especially international commerce, would lead to war, a much more conflictual account of the relationship between economics and politics that my late colleague Istvan Hont organized and described under the heading The Jealousy of Trade. The international economy was seen as a potentially very dangerous place. And the argument Mirabeau was making was that unless the French economy could be restructured, unless priority could be given to agriculture, unless the attempt to reverse the depopulation of the French countryside, unless that could be thrown into reverse, modern France and modern Europe was heading for a decline and fall every bit as dramatic as that which Rome had undergone in the many hundreds of years earlier. And it's very important to take these visions of apocalypse seriously. Rousseau has one, Mirabeau has one, many other writers in the middle of the 18th century, even somebody who's often seen as an apologist for the Ancien Régime, Montesquieu, is very worried about the depopulation in the French countryside and what that means, worried that France will become a new kind of despotism. And so there's this apocalyptic discourse that both Rousseau and Mirabeau are contributing to. They disagree about a lot of things. Rousseau wasn't a physiocrat. He was critical of the physiocratic school. But they agree substantially on this diagnosis that it's precisely the things about modern society that are so often celebrated by the Tom Friedmans of their day, by the apologists for globalization and high culture and so on. It's precisely those things that risk bringing about societal collapse, political collapse. And they had lots of different scenarios for how they thought this would happen, whether a Russian invasion or breakdown or reversion to military despotism and national bankruptcy and so on. There were lots of different plausible scenarios of how all of this might happen. Of course, one of them did come true when the French Revolution started in 1789, the widely forecast terminal systemic crisis of the French public finances. But that's the point I want to focus on, that if we remind ourselves that the word civilization itself began life as an attempt to warn contemporaries that their society was heading for a great big smash-up, civilization was juxtaposed to civility, and just as Rousseau was offering an alternative vision of modernity, Mirabeau, through the Ami des Hommes, was offering his alternative vision, and he called that alternative vision civilization. So civilization right from the start was an alternative kind of modernity, freed from the crisis tendencies that beset the actually existing modern society of the time. And when we put someone like Mirabeau back into the story, voices like Rousseau's seem less like voices in the wilderness, and we're better able to see that Rousseau isn't just the Brendan O'Neill of his day, the person who says no when everyone else says yes. He's not just the contrarian who glibly argues the side of the argument that the fashion of the time doesn't really expect. But he's playing a role in a much broader discourse, diagnosing the difficulties and the pathologies of actually existing modern society. And when we remember that the Enlightenment is a much more, it's not a world of complacent accounts of progress, this one-dimensional account, as so many accounts of the Enlightenment project would have it. It's a much richer field of argument. And when we recover Rousseau's argument in the 1750s and see what he's actually saying and how people like Mirabeau contribute to it, we get a very interesting perspective on what civilization meant when the word and the concept were brand new.
To create some continuity with Dr. Brooke's paper, I thought I'd start with a few remarks about Rousseau. Rousseau was a whinger, an onanist, and a rebel-rouser. He was personally responsible for the great slave rebellion that was the French Revolution, and for the dissemination of a corrupted, populist conception of civilization that threatened to subvert the noble German ideal of Kultur. Or so Nietzsche tells us. My topic, Nietzsche's Kulturkritik, translated maybe as Nietzsche's cultural pessimism, or in the terms of this CREDOC seminar, Nietzsche's critique of civilization, is aimed at bringing out the politics of that critique. And Nietzsche's critique of Rousseau is an integral part of Nietzsche's Kulturkritik. Because for Nietzsche, the democratization and the massification, as he calls it, the Vermassung of civilization, both of which he associated with Rousseau, were the principal threats facing Western civilization in his time. There's a certain irony, an irony sadly lost on Nietzsche himself, that the rhetorical pose that he strikes of the Jeremiah, the cultural Jeremiah, is so similar to that of Rousseau, his perennial bête noire. Yet Nietzsche's critique of civilization is also fundamentally different from Rousseau's. It is quite unique in a number of ways. I think Nietzsche offers an unprecedentedly politicized critique of civilization and of culture more generally. In fact, it is Nietzsche who introduces the, in itself, highly politicized distinction between culture, Kultur, and civilization, where culture, Kultur, refers to a genuine, original, creative, deep, heroic, and of course, German version of Kultur, where civilization is imitative, decorative, shallow, and usually French, but sometimes also English. In the next 10 minutes or so, I want to sketch the political contours of this distinction that Nietzsche draws between Kultur and civilization, and his Kulturkritik more generally. And like Chris, I want to take a somewhat revisionist approach, and I want to talk about two myths in Nietzsche scholarship that have built up around his conception of culture. So there's the first myth, an old myth associated with Walter Kaufmann, and more recently perhaps with Alexander Nehamas, that says Nietzsche's concept of culture is profoundly apolitical, it's individualist, it has to do with self-fashioning. Kultur really for him means self-cultivation, self-fashioning, also in a slightly, in a very individualist sense. It is a concept that is in the tradition of the Enlightenment, that in a way reflects some of the best aspects of the Enlightenment, certain humanism, cosmopolitanism. Nietzsche is writing about culture as a good European. And this is the first myth about Nietzsche's conception I want to call into question. The second is more recent. It's a postmodernist myth, really an attempt to read Nietzsche himself as a proto-postmodernist, and an attempt to read his conception of culture as radically relativistic, as radically pluralistic. Just as Nietzsche, so this myth goes, just as Nietzsche rejected a singular, universal, timeless conception of truth, so he rejected a singular, universal conception of culture. There are many cultures for Nietzsche, as many cultures as there are human visions of the world. His understanding of culture, again, according to this myth, is agonistic, agonal, based on struggle between warring ideas. In this, according to this myth, he becomes the prophet of a multicultural society. Let me tackle the more recent myth, the newer myth, the proto-postmodernist myth first. If you take a closer look at Nietzsche's writings, it becomes clear rather quickly that despite his ethical relativism, he does not embrace a relativistic understanding of culture. In fact, his understanding of culture, Kultur, is surprisingly monolithic, homogeneous, and holistic. I say surprisingly because in his time, in the 1870s and 1880s, there are a number of much more pluralistic and relativistic notions of culture available and quite widely available. For instance, in the field of Kulturanthropologie, cultural anthropology, which in Germany is very much indebted to the Herderian notion of the Volksgeist and the idea that every nation builds up, creates its own culture with its own center of gravity within itself. But this pluralistic notion of culture is also present in Weltgeschichte, or universal history, which is very prominent in the second half of the 19th century in Germany. In fact, Nietzsche's colleague at the University of Basel, Jakob Burckhardt, writes what is perhaps the most important, most influential cultural history of modern times, the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy in 1860, with a precisely wide and broadly conceived understanding of culture. So Burckhardt looks at festivals, rituals, religious practices, jokes, superstitions in Renaissance Italy. Nietzsche, by contrast, takes a much more traditional approach to culture. He's interested almost exclusively in the artistic and intellectual pursuits of great individuals. It's the genius, the great man, or as he would later call it, the Superman, who is the creator of culture. And culture for Nietzsche really is high culture, die schönen Künste, the Le Beaux-Arts, if you want. That's what he understands by culture. And as he says in The Birth of Tragedy, his first major text, 1872, the prerequisite for culture is a unity of style. And anything that goes against this unity creates a form of Philistinism, which for him is one of the antonyms of culture. Culture, this culture produced by great individuals, gives meaning to human existence. It's a system of aesthetic science that provides a protective layer against the horror of existence. It's very much a Schopenhauerian philosophy that underwrites his early works. Unlike Chris, I have done the count, and he does use the word culture 448. I know, it's so German, but he uses it 448 times in his writings, published and unpublished. I'm only mentioning this because he uses the plural Kulturen, cultures, only 7 times. So it's an extraordinary mismatch. So when he speaks of culture, he really is not interested in non-Western, extra-European cultures. It is almost exclusively Western European, meaning primarily German culture, that he's interested in. Civilization, the term civilization, similar features in the singular 107 times and in the plural only 5 times. He is interested in some non-Western cultures, Islam in particular, and also in the Indian caste system, but he invokes these civilizations, Islam in particular, primarily to shoot holes into the Christian values of the Europe of his day. Another sense in which his notion of culture is quite homogeneous comes to the fore in his interpretation of ancient Greek civilization. What makes Hellenic civilization great, according to Nietzsche, is not its diversity, the agonal relationships between individual Greek city-states, as you might expect from him. What makes it great actually is the ability of the Hellenic artists to take up and transform and to homogenize diverse cultural influences and traditions from other civilizations, Phoenician, Egyptian, and so on. That is the basis for him, the foundation for the glory that was Greece. Nietzsche does, however, establish a global perspective on culture, and that is when he writes about humanity, human civilization, in the grandest possible terms. And here I really mean interstellar terms. There are a number of writings, early writings and late writings, where he claims an Archimedean point outside of our planet and looks down on this earth from another star, as if from another star, when he writes about human beings, human civilization, as just a part of other forms of being, as just another biological species, not very different from animals. And to me, that is, in a way, a more globalized vision than some that is taken by our contemporary global historians. So much for the second myth of Nietzsche as a pluralistic interpreter of culture, which I hope I've exploded somewhat here. The older myth, the apolitical myth of Nietzsche as somebody who conceived of culture in profoundly individualistic terms, I think I can tackle quite quickly, and I have to also since I only have 3 minutes left. That myth rests on one statement, really, in his first untimely meditation, which he wrote in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, where he says that the German victory in arms in the Franco-Prussian War has now deluded some German intellectuals and politicians into thinking that this may also have been a victory of German culture. And in fact, this belief, he says, could turn into an extirpation of the German spirit. So Nietzsche is perceived as a prophet of an apolitical culture here, somebody who holds up the German Kulturnation, cultural nation, against the German Staatsnation, somebody who did not believe that the state, which he at other times calls the coldest of all cold monsters, could do anything constructive, could contribute to cultural greatness or cultural excellence in any way. And that simply is not true. Nietzsche reflects almost throughout his entire career about the possibilities of politically enhancing culture, what the state can do, what the state must do in order to strengthen and further culture. And one of his earliest texts, an unpublished essay called The Greek State, he says that what made Greek civilization great was the existence of slavery. And if Germany, the supposed inheritor of ancient Greek cultural excellence, wants the same kind of greatness, it must introduce slavery. It's an extraordinary claim, and I'm going to read it out to you in a quotation here from The Greek State, 1871. Quote, "In order that there may be a broad, deep, and fruitful soil for the development of art, the enormous majority must, in the service of a minority, be slavishly subjected to life's struggle. At their expense, through the surplus of their labor, that privileged class is to be relieved from the struggle for existence in order to create and to satisfy a new world of one. And it's the state that has to establish these hierarchies, that has to reintroduce things such as slavery. It is the state that has to establish a kind of rank ordering in society which alone will guarantee continued cultural excellence. Nietzsche believes that war, military conflict, is culturally enhancing too. And he claims that Western civilization has become decadent, has become enfeebled, muttered, precisely because of this absence of war, of military conflict. And it's only in war and through war, or as he in other moments calls it, relapses into barbarism, that the civilization can be renewed and rejuvenated. I was wondering if anybody was going to use that famous oft-quoted line by Walter Benjamin, that there is not a single document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. Really a play on, has probably been used before in this CREDOC seminar. It really has been quoted to death. But Benjamin talks about a triumphal procession there, and he's horrified by the idea of what kind of cruelty has gone into the artwork that is being paraded through the streets of Rome, say. Nietzsche, on the contrary, says it is precisely that kind of cruelty, that kind of violence that produces great art, that inspires artists, that makes people like Homer write their great epics. We need that violence, we need that destruction. This is Nietzsche's argument. A rebarbarization of Western civilization is necessary. So by looking at the politics of Nietzsche's Kulturkritik, of his critique of civilization, we touched on some of the most intriguing and fascinating, but also at some of the most problematic aspects of his philosophy. Thank you.
Well, by the time the term civilization was engaged by those who received it from Europe in places like Africa and Asia, it came paired with another race. The interesting thing about both of these terms, both of these categories, is that they were global without being universal. They were global in the way they were imagined across the surface of the earth, but interestingly imagined in such a way as not to be coterminous with any state, with any political entity. So there was a constant anxiety about who might actually represent, what might actually represent race or indeed civilization. But as I said, they were not universal. They were exclusionary categories for the most part. Race by definition, civilization very often, and I'm passing quite quickly along these words, very often seen in terms of what would come to be called a liberal project of pedagogy. That you might not be civilized today, but with the appropriate tutelage, you will become so in some undefined future. Now, non-European thinkers and political actors, and I'll be focusing on India today, tended to approach this pair of categories, which, as I said, were both global and yet not universal, in roughly two kinds of ways. On the one hand, you have figures like Nehru, who goes on to become India's first prime minister, and he's not alone, who try to actually universalize such categories, not race, but certainly civilization. And this is only one of the categories that for which universality is sought. And these figures realize that whether they're talking about Kant or John Stuart Mill, the thought associated with these great individuals was not meant to be universal in the sense of completely inclusive. What people like Nehru, tried to do then was precisely to universalize it. And their role in this attempted universalization, which today goes under the name, and I think both of you refer to it indirectly, of the Enlightenment project. That project might, with some alterations, be seen originating, at least in some senses, with these non-European figures. So with Nehru, you have, for instance, questions of the following kind. There are two Englands. There is the England of freedom and civilization and prosperity and opportunity, and then there is the England of colonialism, of oppression, of inequality, of exploitation. How do you bring those two things together? How do you actually get the good England to win out? And that would have been the task of someone like Nehru. He sought, in other words, to make England true to herself. And this was a form of locution that was very common among such figures. And what it results in is very interesting. It results in the fact that hypocrisy comes to be seen as the major sin. So otherwise, of course, a very minor infraction, hypocrisy. I mention this in particular because even today, when you think about the fervid or even tired invocations of East-West antagonism, hypocrisy continues to be crucial in the way in which this antagonism is phrased. The West is hypocritical. America is hypocritical. Europe is hypocritical in doing X, Y, or Z. And it's worth considering why hypocrisy becomes a word of this sort. One reason why it does, I think, is because what interests and concerns figures like Nehru is precisely the betrayal by Europe of herself, of Western civilization by itself. It's not the betrayal of us, it's the betrayal of themselves that is of concern in this attempt to universalize categories like civilization. Now, on the other hand, this is what I've described as one way of dealing with categories such as race, always paired up with civilization. On the other hand, you have those like Nehru's sometime mentor and leader, Gandhi, who rejected the categories and their universality altogether. They were just not interested. For someone like Gandhi, Western civilization was a kind of ironic joke. So many of you might know, it's become a cliche, the fact that, or at least the story, that when Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization, he said it would be a good idea. And this was typical of him, this sort of ironic reference to Western civilization as a good idea, because in fact he believed that such a thing was impossible. There was no such thing as Western civilization. There was only modern civilization and what he variously called ancient civilization. And the thing about modern civilization, which he identified with industrial civilization, let's say, was that it made any ownership of itself impossible. All right, so the West, the British, Europe, whatever term you want to use, might lay claim to this thing, but all of them, like everyone else, would be chewed up and spat out by this thing called modern civilization, which allowed for no ownership of itself, because it was a process that ended up destroying the subject altogether. And Gandhi described this destruction of subjectivity by saying that what modern industrial civilization does is to make a subject, or rather destroy a subject, by making it into the site of more and more needs, wants, and desires. That such a subject ceases to be one precisely because it becomes conceived of in purely consumptive terms. It's simply there to consume, to create and then consume more and more. And in so doing, it dissipates completely. It becomes the victim of the process. It cannot own this process. which is why he also says, look, Japan is now more modern, as it were, than Britain. So Japan is more British than Britain is. Britain cannot own this thing that they claim to own, nor Europe, nor the West, whatever term you want to use. He was then, therefore, very interested in the possibility of creating a new kind of subject, which would be founded not on wants and desires, the wants and desires created by industrial civilization, but rather on abstinence and sacrifice. That's how a moral and indeed political subject is created. Right? He also thought that the destruction of the subject, which is what made the ownership of anything called civilization impossible, at the same time led to invocations of the human or of humanity. Right? So he says in his famous text of 1909, Hind Swaraj, look, it's only people who travel by train who can actually conceive of rendering some service to humanity. They can actually, because they move across the landscape so fast, they don't live in any society while they're doing this. They are so borne aloft by technology that they can somehow believe in this fantasy that a human race not only exists, but that they can do something to serve it. Gandhi thought that this invocation of humanity was the sign of the destruction precisely of a subject, of a moral and a political subject, because the humanity which was invoked only as a potential object for violence. Right? And so he's against invocations of humanity altogether, as he's against, later on in his career, human rights, etc. We might talk about that later. Now, for someone like Muhammad Iqbal, who was Gandhi's compatriot and contemporary and a philosopher in India, humanity was precisely what was required. So for Iqbal, categories like race and civilization, seen together, as always, were understood as being embodiments and guarantors of private property. They were exclusionary by definition, and they could only be set aside by invoking the human race, humanity, as such. And to do this, he thought, one would have to turn to non-modern forms of thought and practice. He argued, for example, that he was a Muslim thinker. So he argued that the Prophet Muhammad, in declaring the finality of prophecy with himself, was putting an end to all extra-human or divine authority in human affairs and introducing for the first time, he imagined, the figure of the human as the agent, the sole agent of history. It's actually an abolition of God that is occurring with the founding of Islam, according to Iqbal. And it's perhaps not accidental and very interesting that he was an admirer of Nietzsche, whom he also, of course, criticized. So, but what this context that provided by humanity made possible for Iqbal was a new kind of anxiety, linked to the one that I started out by mentioning, the anxiety of these categories which don't have any political instantiation, who is to represent them. So for someone like Iqbal, the fact that you abolish race, civilization, and nationality in some ways and invoke the human meant that there's an eternal, as it were, competition between different groups of people and individuals to represent this thing called the human race, which otherwise cannot be represented, which cannot represent itself. And it leads to a curious kind of apologetics in which, and you see signs of this to this day in Pacific as well as militant forms of Islam, in which you might argue, or such a person might argue, look, we Muslims started out as truly universal figures. We recognize the importance of the human and egalitarianism and all the rest. We didn't cut people up in terms of nationality, race, and so on and so forth. But we have lost this capacity. The West has in some ways taken it over. So what we need to do is recover ourselves from the other. So the competitive element here is one which presumes intimacy at the same time. It's precisely the lack of the divisions that Iqbal criticizes that allows this new kind of anxiety and to emerge, this very fluid one. So I'd like to end by returning to Europe and thinking about what was mentioned at the very beginning of this session, the way in which civilization has, especially in the post-Cold War world, become a word that we conjure with again. It's returned. More than religion, it's civilization in a way that has, or seems to have returned. And you can see why, in some sense, a post-Cold War world in which you have a global arena with no geopolitics of the Cold War kind, no hemispheric divisions, in which politics occurs in a global arena, but the global arena, as it were, doesn't provide any categories for itself. Civilization comes to be important for such a world or such a global arena, famously, of course, through Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory, which is popular everywhere. It was very popular in Al-Qaeda, for instance. Bin Laden used to mention favorably Samuel Huntington, much to his horror, I imagine, or maybe not. This is particularly true, I think, of Europe. The figure of Europe itself, a semi or non-sovereign entity, the EU, right? For which European identity, Europeanness, European or Western civilization has become a question again of a different kind, of a new kind. And it can't help but strike me, given what I study and research, that the way in which this civilization or this European identity is talked about has so much to do or derives so much from the colonial discussions I began by citing, that they must be connected in some sense. When you think about the way in which the aggressive civilization or culture of Islam is seen, it's almost a mirror image of the way in which the West or European civilization was seen in the colonies in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You have an irresistible force represented by small numbers of people, but people who have great violence at their disposal that will run over and take over our societies, cultures, etc. But more than this, the very fact that the identity European seems to be looking for a site for itself has, I think, a link to the colonial empires. After all, it was only there that the term European seemed to have taken on a sociological reality. People could actually say, oh, we are European. There were signs, Europeans only, European and Asian. I wonder if it's true to suggest that in Europe itself during this period, it was commonplace for people to self-identify as European. It was, of course, in figures like Nietzsche, where European is an important category. But twinned as this revival of European identity seems to be with the colonial mode of reasoning. We are under attack by a superior civilization, which is a minority today in our countries, but will certainly take us over in the future. I think, or I would like to speculate that the idea of Europe and of its civilization has returned back from the empires where it had only ever possessed its reality. Thank you.
So I hand shoot up in the middle.
Thank you. It had never crossed my mind that the word civilization actually doesn't occur in Rousseau. But it seems to me that when one reads Condorcet, then although I don't know whether Condorcet actually uses the word civilization or not, but if you read Condorcet, one always gets a feeling that the notion of civilization seems to permeate his thinking. So the idea of civilization must have been around, even though the word itself doesn't occur in Rousseau.
No, I was focusing very much on the 1750s. So the period from Rousseau's composition of the first discourse through to the publication of the second discourse, and then a year or so afterwards, the appearance of Mirabeau's L'Ami des Hommes. The word catches on very quickly. Within a few years, it's appearing in reference books, like the big Jesuit handbook they have, and quite quickly the word comes to be used to mean a lot of different things. And if you turn to the 1790s period, on the one hand you have someone like Condorcet, and as you say, he does write in exactly the way you've described. And then on the other hand, at the end of the decade, you've got the utopian Charles Fourier beginning his speculations. And for him, civilization is his label for the contemporary society that will be displaced by something that people come to call socialism. So civilization is bad for Fourier. So it is a word that very quickly is disseminated throughout French, and then it also pops up in English. Estimate Brown, a cheerleader for Pitt, is one of the first people to use it. And very quickly the term starts to be used in a number of different ways. So I was talking about the 1750s when the word appears for the very first time, but a lot of water has passed under various bridges by the time we get to Condorcet writing at the end of his life in the period of the French Revolution. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on the correlation between civilization and religion, because obviously from maybe late Roman times until at least the 17th century, Christianity was linked to civilization. But then suddenly there's a point where you are civilized when you are criticizing religion. And I mean, obviously Nietzsche is the prime example at the very end, saying that religion destroys creative culture. So when did civilization become linked to secularism? And when did that change, so that now in the debate on Islam, for example, we have exactly the opposite of the link between Christianity and civilization?
You're absolutely right. Nietzsche tries to decouple those terms quite aggressively in a way, quite radically. He also thinks that civilization should not be seen as the opposite of nature, and he thinks that it's Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular, that has denaturalized civilization, has made us unnatural in a way. So the decadence that he sees around himself has a lot to do with this denaturalized culture or civilization that is no longer able to fathom and to face up to its violent, aggressive origins in in human nature, and that he wants to undo with his own transvaluation of values. But I think in his day, that's why he's writing as this Jeremiah figure. The two were still quite closely linked, civilization and Christianity.
What I find interesting about contemporary Islamism, Islamist movements, and there are many different kinds, is their really ferocious refusal to be defined by the word civilization, and even more so by culture, and the two are often they're taken one for the other. And it seems to me that this is in part a result from that earlier critique of the partiality of civilization that I started out my talk with. So what you have is the desire to embody a universality that is nothing short of human. But how to do it? To do it by losing culture and civilization. So to make Islam into something that is so abstract, that is a bit like a computer code, that precisely because it's not tied to anything local, and is not tied even to anything necessarily instrumental, it's about a set of practices which no longer have meaning culturally. Right? And that is what makes them universal, or potentially universal. And that's what I find, in a way, it's the last or at least I hope, the last point to which the critique of the partiality of European civilization is taken, but this time Islamic civilization as well, itself a European construct, is submitted to this critique, so that there's an attempt to exit culture and civilization altogether.
Christopher, could I press you for a response as well? I mean, it would seem that your vocabularistic point is relevant.
No, that's right. I mean, if you ask the question, why did Rousseau have such a colossal falling out with all the other major figures of the French Enlightenment, one of the most plausible starting points is that he was religious and they were not, and he didn't like the secularism and the atheism he associated with, the Epicureanism he associated with Voltaire and the people around D'Holbach and so on. And if we go back to this point about when the word civilization appears, in this book by Mirabeau, one of the things he says when he uses the word for the very first time is that religion is one of the springs of civilization. So when people are juxtaposing civilization, which is good, to civility, which is not so good, it's civility, it's the actually existing modernity, which is seen as secularizing, and critics like Rousseau think that's part of the problem, and so we can associate, an alternative civilization has a proper place for religion in human society, which is being lost in modern France, modern Britain.
I was wondering if you could expand a bit on ancient Greek civilization as a foundational narrative for European states, in spite of ancient Greece actually being rooted in the so-called Asian world.
With reference to Nietzsche or more generally?
Well,
Any. Okay. The idea in Germany in the 19th century is that the Germans have an elective affinity with the ancient Greeks, that they are somehow the successors and inheritors of ancient Hellenic civilization, and it's their task, their world historical mission in a way to manifest a civilization that is as great, as splendid, and so on. Nietzsche believes that the understanding, the contemporary European, I guess to some extent still Winckelmannian, liberal, neoclassical understanding of ancient Greek civilization is deeply flawed. He wants to reevaluate, I guess, transvaluate that understanding. He says to really grasp what Greek civilization was about, we have to move away from Periclean Athens, which is seen as the cradle of modern civilization, right, modern democracy in particular, and have to go back further in time to the archaic age, the Homeric age in particular, undemocratic or pre-democratic, aristocratic. That's when Greek civilization really revealed its true colors, when it was truly great, to this agonal or agonistic culture, this warlike, more martial civilization that he's obsessed with. So yes, the Greeks are foundational for Nietzsche, but they have been misunderstood by everyone else except Nietzsche.
For the period I'm interested in, the 18th century, people are far more interested in Rome. They have a richer sense that they're, in Western Europe, Rome was there, Greece was a long way away. They still speak dialects of Latin, modern languages like French. They're very conscious of how much they owe to the Roman past. But they're also gripped by the narrative of Rome's decline and fall. That's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is one of the great books of the 18th century. A lot of them are haunted by the fear that what happened to Rome once upon a time is going to happen again, that this period of wealth and luxury and greatness will be followed by another period of catastrophe. So you always get people interested in Greece, but the fixation on Rome is far more widespread. If we do look, though, beyond this particular argument to how 18th century figures wrote about the ancient Mediterranean, one of the, I think, pleasant things is that they have a much more polycentric vision of the ancient Mediterranean. So the big the big textbooks at the time, published in English and French, will have chapters on the Assyrians, chapters on the Egyptians, chapters on the Greeks and the Romans and the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. They'll go around the Mediterranean and the Near East talking about everyone. And the sources will largely all be from Greek and Roman sources. For a lot of these, also Jewish texts, of course. But and it's in the, so they have a very interesting sense in the Mediterranean as a complex space where there are lots of different peoples. And it's in the period between, I think, the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century that the optic narrows enormously to become this absolutely massive cultural fixation on Greece on the one hand, with a focus on ancient Athens and ancient Athenian democracy, and Rome on the other, and the rest of the ancient Mediterranean is sort of erased from the popular mindset. So the 18th century ancient Mediterranean imagining of the ancient Mediterranean is a much more multicultural place, as it were. I think it's the French Revolution that puts democracy back on the map and gets people thinking seriously about what ancient democracy might have to do with modern forms of popular government. It's the Greek struggle for independence in the 1820s that means that extremely influential people like Lord Byron get terribly excited. It's during the revolutionary and the Romantic period that Greece begins to loom very, very large again in the Western European imagination. In my period in the 18th century, the fixation is still very much on Rome, and it's an anxious fixation on what happened to Rome and the likelihood that it's going to happen again.
As a classicist, what I then think is really interesting is to ask in what respect in India any of the debates that were critiquing civilization as it was understood in the West responded to that way in which ancient Greece and ancient Rome were perceived as either exemplars or as models of a possible, narrative of decline. Was that any part of the kind of critique that took place of civilization and a different way of thinking about what the past was going to offer as a story about the present and the future, and about sort of progress, since progress is obviously closely related to ideas of civilization?
Yes, there was. You have, the background for this, of course, is the way in which many early British administrators and writers had invoked Rome in particular for India, right? Britain's role in India was Roman in a sense. Pax Britannica, these kinds of words, very Roman. But when you have Indian writers, if you think of some, the two I mentioned, Gandhi and Iqbal, both refer. So, Gandhi writes about how it's the fact that India is stolid, in his words, and unchanging that makes it virtuous. That means that there is virtue in it. So the very thing that the British are saying is bad about India is what is good about her. And this is what also makes India a survivor. Rome and Greece are finished, and Egypt. Those are the three that I usually mentioned. But we are still here. So that this vision of the relationship is not one based on great empires and kingdoms and high culture. It's about, the British can have that. That's their narrative about their role in India. What people like Gandhi are thinking about is the stolidity of Indian society. And because he counts it as being part of ancient civilization, that is what makes it kin to Greece and Rome and Egypt, but not at the level of high culture. So exactly the opposite of Nietzsche. Or Iqbal, for instance, has a famous poem, famous in India, called Tarana-e-Hindi, the Indian anthem. Where he says, Yunan or Misra, Roma, Yunan, Ionia, Greece, Misra is Egypt, Roma, Rome. All of these have gone. But despite the fact that the heavens have been against us, the revolving heavens, the wheel of fortune, we still survive. So it's in that, it's the decline of Greece and Rome is never seen as a foretaste of our decline, because it's not linked to empire. It's the British who have that bit, so they have to worry about their decline.
Nietzsche interestingly contrasts the decline of the Roman Empire and the decline of the British Empire. He says when the Romans, after having become imperial, had grown rather tired of war, they attempted to gain new strength by beast baitings, gladiatorial combats, and Christian persecutions. The English of today, who appear on the whole to have also renounced war, adopt other means in order to generate anew those vanishing forces, namely the dangerous exploring expeditions, sea voyages, and mountaineerings, nominally undertaken for scientific purposes, but in reality to bring home surplus strength from adventures and dangers of all kinds. So if you can't wage war, then you go into the mountains. It's not really the same thing for Nietzsche.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
The philosophers of the French Enlightenment presumably believed in enlightenment, but didn't this have a sort of social and political aspect to it? Or was it all just individual? I mean, wasn't it, in other words, isn't it a kind of alternative term for civilization, if you think of civilization as an ideal social state of affairs?
So one of the issues we face is that in the Enlightenment, most people didn't. Famously, there isn't a word for enlightenment in French, so whatever they talked about, it wasn't planned. There was a language of lumière, and in German, especially when people are worrying about Christianity in the modern world, there's a particular discourse of Aufklärung, and that's what the famous title of Immanuel Kant's essay, Was ist Aufklärung, is referring to. And he sort of sets up the debate in ways that it's no longer chiefly about Christianity. But in Paris, they don't have this, they don't think they're part, whatever they think about themselves, our language of enlightenment is one we've projected back onto the period much more thoroughly than they ever used it themselves. But you're right, I mean, there's a whole load of interesting social processes underway involving changes in, there's a rich social history and lots of Enlightenment historians have documented it. There's thousands and thousands of books and articles have been written about coffee house culture and how that changes polite conversation and how that changes social norms and how that changes the way people engage with one another and so on. And some people want to link this up to what's going on in the circles around Diderot and D'Alembert, and other people don't want to do that so much because of the different tastes in how to write history. But I think the point I want to come back to is that when you get a writer like Rousseau, who makes the apocalyptic argument and that's very close to what Mirabeau will be arguing for when Mirabeau coins the word civilization, I mean, it is directed against someone like Voltaire. I mean, there are deep reasons why Voltaire hated Rousseau's books, because he's being constructed as the person who he's celebrating what's polished but also what's radically superficial about modern France, about modern Europe. And it's that combination of politeness, commerce, this idea that having lots and lots of commerce will promote international peace. This is what's being targeted by the people who are the first to pioneer the word civilization. This idea that there are a lot of apologists for what's going on in France at the moment, and they're backing the wrong horse, because it's these developments in 18th century society which are ultimately going to doom Europe to another age of barbarism. So it's a dispute within the people we think, within the Enlightenment camp, about what they think the trajectory of modern France is on. But they're always, whether these people are on the Voltaire side or the Mirabeau side of the argument, they're always interested in what's new, in the processes that seem to be the most recent, the most striking, the most modern. So it's very much an engagement with the what's actually going on around them.
I guess the person who most radically calls into question that equation Enlightenment and civilization is Herder, Johann Gottfried Herder in Germany. He says that this is part of the arrogance, really, of the Westerners, of the Western Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire, he singles out Voltaire in particular, and also an arrogance that fuels the entire colonial project. So they're imposing their own enlightened notions of civilization on non-Western societies. Herder's one of the first few 18th 18th century champions, really, of the anti-imperialist argument. And he, precisely on the basis that civilization cannot be identified with enlightenment. Every nation, every country has its own Volksgeist, national spirit, realizing its own civilizational mission, as it were. Right? There is no singular universal civilization. And how arrogant of the West to say that their own enlightened 18th century is the pinnacle of civilization. That's Herder's argument. Very interesting, man.
Thank you. I'm wondering how the United States factors into the three different kinds of discussions that you've been talking about. It offers an example of a different kind of civilization that bears affinities to Europe but is also different from Europe. It's an example of a kind of colonialism but also a breakaway from colonialism. There's a complicated relationship with an indigenous population and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping you might have a few words to say on that.
In the period I was addressing most directly, of course, the United States didn't exist, although there was the ongoing colonization and the English colonies were set up there. The dispossession of the native population was well underway. Slavery had been firmly established on the far side of the Atlantic. If we look at this world of Enlightenment thinkers who are very skeptical about the future trajectory of Europe, they're often quite optimistic about the future of America. Someone like Adam Smith would be quite a good example of this, because these people like Mirabeau for the physiocrats and Smith for his own, it's an anti-physiocratic theory, but it shares certain things in common with the French argument. The reason Europe was peculiarly messed up and likely to end up in social catastrophe was because the interests of agriculture were being, the agricultural interest had been permanently subordinated to the interests of people producing manufactured goods for the luxury market in the cities. And it's that concern with the impoverishment of the French countryside, depopulation, and so on, that is really driving so many of these arguments from Fénelon at the turn of the 18th century through Montesquieu and Rousseau and Mirabeau in France, and that Smith is a close student of these debates and then presents his own version of this in The Wealth of Nations. And these people, because Europe has these, Britain has these enormous agricultural estates, primogeniture that will ensure that they'll be held together. The working population has no secure access to land that they can call their own. In France, agriculture has been impoverished and the population is migrating to the cities where a lot of them won't find work. And if you think that that's the crisis that Europe is running into, when you look across the Atlantic, it looks very different. Because you've got a growing population, and all these people are populationists. They want the population to grow. They think that's the best example of a healthy symptom of a healthy society. But the European population, as it grows in America, it has land to occupy. These people aren't especially bothered about shooing the Native Americans off the land and killing them. I mean, Rousseau makes indignant protests on their behalf, but he's not one of the key people in this kind of argument. And they see that the reason, from this point of view, you can be extraordinarily optimistic about the future of America, bracketing slavery, which again, these European political economists don't tend to admire at all. Smith is very critical of the institution of New World slavery in The Wealth of Nations. But they're very optimistic about the future of New England and the colonies, the territories that are based on free labor, because they see that as people continue to expand west and as new agricultural land gets opened up, you can have an economy that's based on agriculture, where a growing population will continue to have access to land. And this is what Smith calls the natural development of opulence, as opposed to what he calls the retrograde history of opulence that Europe has undergone. So there's a great optimism in North America. Slavery is seen as a problem. Native Americans don't figure much in people's thinking about what's happening. To say something provocative about how this argument plays out in Germany and points eastwards, Ian McDaniel at Sussex University has extraordinarily interesting research about how these arguments, as they play out in Germany, as people worry about how a growing population will have access to land, is one of the reasons in the 19th century that so many German intellectuals get interested in colonization schemes, first in Poland and then in Ukraine. And so this is, when the Nazis come to power and actually try to implement those programs, there's a long prehistory of German intellectuals, often liberals, often constitutionalists, who think that unless Germany can turn Ukraine into the breadbasket of a new liberal, constitutionalist, somewhat democratic Germany, that constitutionalism won't survive. So these arguments are they're of extraordinary interest.
I think we're going to have to stop you there and just ask whether you would like to make any further comment either on the issue of the United States or on the kind of conversations.
Very, very quickly, by the time Nietzsche comes around, the US are more like Europe, and they're already becoming decadent, materialistic. Nietzsche follows the slavery issue very closely. He thinks the American Civil War is a big mistake. He wants to he thinks they should have preserved slavery. He says Harry Beecher Stowe is a deluded disciple of Rousseau. And he invokes Treitschke's famous dictum that the English confuse soap with civilization, and I say that the Americans make the similar confusion, right? So it's part of an anti-American discourse that has already started in Germany at that time. Materialistic, shallow, superficial.
I think there are two contradictory ways of approaching America for these Indian thinkers of the early 20th century. One is that, like the Soviet Union, America represents some other form of order, unlike imperial European societies. And these are also for places or sites that are sites for rebellion and resistance. So you can have people going off there, migrating and coming back to India. Both the Soviet Union and America, but also Germany as England's enemy, or the Ottoman Empire while it existed. On the other hand, of course, you have America representing the most fearsome consequences of imperialism. The wiping out of an entire indigenous population and the transplantation of European civilization, if you will, there. So there's that on the one hand, and then slavery and racism, African American on the other bit, were constantly invoked. So this is the, both at the same time a site of refuge and resistance and hope, and the worst possible example of European civilization in that sense.
Well, thank you very much. Probably more of the latter than the former these days. But perhaps this is the moment when we should say thank you very much to our speakers for a really provocative and stimulating focus on the beginnings of civilization and in the kind of intellectual sense of its the emergence of the vocabulary and all the different manifestations it has been very helpful indeed for us. And if I could just remind you all that there is, I hope, a reception next door. I always get very nervous that we might walk out and find there's nothing there, but hopefully there are glasses and stuff out there, so do join us. But first, could we please just thank our speakers for